Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. This is an incredibly timely meeting, as many of you have already observed. Last week, hot on the heels of the IPCC special report, WWF launched its Living Planet report, in which we are informed that population abundances across 16,000 populations of 4,500 species of mammals, birds, reptiles and amphibians and fish that have been studied since the 1970s have declined by an average of 60%. These declines are occurring in all regions, all bioregions, and are ranging from 23% in the Arctic through to 89%. 89% decline in the neotropics. Now, as shocking and worrying as these trends are in isolation, they become even more staggering when we recognise that during the same time frame, we've seen a massive increase in protected area coverage on land and in the sea. Now, our failure to stabilise climate and protect nature stem from the fact, I believe, that we are treating these things as isolated problems, where in fact they are two sides of the same coin. We cannot deal with climate change without tackling biodiversity loss. We can't deal with biodiversity loss without tackling climate change. They have the same drivers, they have the same solutions. Now, set against, the other thing I wanted to say was not only are these problems being treated in isolation from one another, there is
also a disproportionate amount of attention being placed on climate change relative to biodiversity loss. Here are some interesting figures published earlier on this year, in which we see that enormous amounts of research and funding, and especially media attention, is disproportionately given to climate change relative to biodiversity loss. And this is a very dangerous situation. This is leading to policies, to climate change policies, which will go against our efforts to deal with biodiversity loss and achieve sustainable development. Now, set against the backdrop of what I can only describe as a spectacular failure, so we are seeing the rise of nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions, depending on what side of the Atlantic you mainly work on. The idea here is beautifully simple, as we heard in talks yesterday, that if we work with nature, if we maintain the potential of the planet, the evolutionary potential of the planet by working with nature, we will protect biodiversity. In protecting biodiversity, we will secure the flow of ecosystem goods and services, which are the foundation of human well-being. Now, we heard yesterday quite a lot about the role of ecosystems, and in particular the role of forest in helping us deal with climate change mitigation. But today I want to really focus our attention on the role of those ecosystems in dealing with climate change adaptation. And by adaptation today, we're talking about human adaptation and human resilience in a changing world. Now, you'll appreciate this is a different framing of the relationship between biodiversity and climate change that perhaps in this community we're used to thinking of. Normally we think about biodiversity as a vulnerability to climate change. In this framing, we're thinking about biodiversity as our main ally in dealing with climate change and achieving sustainable development. Now, of course, human beings have been working with nature for millennia to deal with the impacts of climatic variability. But it's only really quite recently that we've seen this idea of nature-based solutions for adaptation, or ecosystem-based adaptation, as it's more commonly known, at least in the world of practitioners, really getting a lot of attention in international discourse. And in fact, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of nature-based solutions, or EBA projects, being implemented across the globe. So in answer to your question yesterday, Nancy, there are a lot of examples of this. But the problem is these projects tend to be quite small, they tend to be underfinanced, they're not sustained over the long run. And a big part of this, as I will argue, is that it's because they are not being informed by all this ecosystem science that we're also familiar with. So in this context, nature-based solutions, or EBA, is protecting forests and wetlands and catchment areas, to secure and regulate water supplies, to restore coastal ecosystems, to protect communities from storm surges, to plant trees among crops or crops among trees, to enhance or even maintain yields in dry and more variable climate, and of course green infrastructure in cities. This is something we heard about yesterday. But what is the evidence? What's the actual evidence that nature-based solutions are ecologically sound, financially viable, equitably governed, and yield genuine benefits for people, as is being widely claimed? So to get some way to addressing at least part of this very broad and important question, we've started we commenced a systematic review of the effectiveness for nature-based solutions in supporting human adaptation. And here we mean effectiveness of different restoration, protection, management approaches within natural ecosystems in this case, in reducing the direct impacts from climate change, whilst also delivering positive ecological, social and economic outcomes. Now, in my naivety, because I had never conducted a systematic review before, I thought, when I accepted to give this talk many, many months ago, that I would have a full evidence map to showcase with you today. How I thought I was going to talk through an evidence map in 20 minutes, I have no idea. But this has proved to be incredibly technically challenging and a very, very time-consuming task. Just working out this search string and getting it to work and capture the scope of our study took a long time, lots of consultation with an expert steering committee, and Val Capos from WCMC, who's here today, was part of that process. This took a very long time. I had also completely underestimated just how much potentially important work there is, or relevant work there is out there. So the initial application of the search string generated 23,000 potentially relevant studies. And this is in the peer-reviewed literature only, I hasten to add. There's a lot of learning going on that's not in the peer-reviewed literature. Interestingly, around 50% of this has been published since 2012. So this is a hugely, massively important growth area in natural and physical engineering and social sciences. This is massive. So for the time being, we're just concentrating on the 11,000 studies since 2012. We've done a lot of screening, and we're basically, by applying quite a rigorous search criteria, we've basically got this sample size down to 1,000. And we're really here focusing on studies that have a baseline against which they can measure effectiveness, and ones which have actually reported impacts or outcomes of these different interventions. But in short, evidence for the effectiveness of nature-based solutions is scattered among different disciplines and literatures. It's hidden behind all sorts of different framings, and there are a major evidence gap. I mean, it's incredibly hard as a scientist to find out what's relevant in this space, never mind a decision maker, a policy maker, or a practitioner. And so what we're trying to do is bring all this together, produce an evidence tool, and launch it at the UN COP in December, so that people can find evidence filtered by habitat, threat, and type of intervention, so we can link more directly the science to the policy making. But I want to give a bit of a snapshot. Now, I've had to revise my talk a little bit, because actually there's already been quite a lot of talk about nature-based solutions, which is a very encouraging situation. And also I realise there's also an awful lot of expertise in the audience about the effectiveness of nature-based solutions in various contexts. But for many of you, it will therefore come as no surprise that by far and away most of the evidence is coming from the coastal zone, coming from studies of coral reefs, seagrass beds, mangroves in the tropics, dunes, salt marshes and oyster beds in the temperate zone, with most of the rich evidence coming from basically decades of studies of mangroves and salt marshes. And there's a wealth of evidence from a wide range of different modelling, experimental, field and increasingly observational studies and long-term studies as well. And what all these studies together indicate that, yes, these coastal ecosystems can provide a wide range of different regulating services. Just to give some examples, coral reefs can reduce the energy in storms by around 97%, with most of that being affected by the reef crest. Salt marshes and mangroves can reduce the energy in waves and reduce wave height by between 60 and 80%. Meanwhile, that coastal vegetation obviously binds soil, stabilizes shorelines, the aerial roots of mangroves, trap debris, which is very important in dealing with very intense storms and tsunamis. And also, as we know, these coastal ecosystems also capture and store very high amounts of carbon. We know that the CO2 burial rates in coastal ecosystems, particularly in mangroves, are around 20% higher than terrestrial ecosystems. Edvinda might have some more precise figures on that, but nonetheless, very, very important for mitigation. And clearly, coastal ecosystems, as we've talked about, are very important in terms of co-benefits. They support major economically important fisheries, livelihoods and so on, and they slow saltwater intrusion, so they protect the agricultural productivity of the inland areas. Now, of course, what we're finding, and what I found very interesting, is that the relationships, the effectiveness in terms of these regulating services are very strongly predicted by the extent of habitat, the vegetation structure, and particularly the complexity of the structure, the density of the vegetation, and there are a growing number of studies indicating indicating that the diversity, so the species richness of these systems, also positively predicts these regulating services and certainly predicts other co-benefits and ecosystem services. There's lots of interesting devil in the detail, of course, and we find that there is a strong influence on the type and intensity, the speed and the volume of the different types of storms and floods and so on. This really influences the effectiveness of nature-based approaches, and also the geomorphology, with some debates raging around the relative role of vegetation versus landscape structure in mitigating storm damage. But there's a lot of uncertainty around extreme events. Now, there was a recent study done on the effectiveness of nature-based approaches to flood mitigation in fluvial areas based on a rich body of work, mainly done in the UK, actually. And what this tended to show is that up to a certain size of flood volume, that actually nature-based approaches were just as, if not better, or more effective than engineered. However, beyond a certain level of threat or a level of intensity of storm, they failed to deliver those benefits. However, we need to be very careful and not to be too hasty in dismissing the role of nature-based approaches in extreme conditions, because we actually don't have very much data for that space. There isn't very much data for extreme storms or extreme floods, and that's something that we as a community need to address. In terms of economic assessment, fewer than 3% of studies do economic evaluations at all, and most of these are very much back-of-the-envelope cost-benefit analyses, with a few notable exceptions. And something that Val Capos has been going on about for a long time is that what we really, really lack are proper cost-effectiveness analyses in these different studies and comparisons between green and grey in that way. Most of the challenge around doing those analyses come from the challenges around ecosystem service valuation, something I'll get back to in a minute. Most convincing or interesting data comes from the economics of avoided damages. So a recent study showed that annual damages from flooding would double and costs from storms would triple in the absence of reefs globally. That there's a lot of data from the USA on the importance of coastal salt marshes in protecting property. So an average of $23.2 billion US per year of avoided property damage over the course of 34 hurricanes between 1980 and 2007. And then what's increasingly happening, but needs to happen in a much more robust way, is estimating the cost in terms of lost ecosystem services through deforestation. There's lots of work done by Lucy Emerton and colleagues in mangroves, in one study showing that over 20 years, deforestation of mangroves resulted in the loss of $32 million in ecosystem services. The shrimp farms that they were replaced with generated half that amount. So we need more of that work. So this is a very, very high-level overview, but what all this work that we're reviewing seems to be pointing for, or seems to be supporting many aspects of the narrative about the relative benefits of nature-based versus engineering approaches. Nature-based solutions can protect from multiple hazards. They bring all these co-benefits for carbon and biodiversity. They self-repair. There's a lot of good data now that they can, in some cases, oyster beds, coral reefs, and others can keep pace with things like sea level rise, but they offer variable protection. There's all sorts of interest around the role of the seasonality of biomass production and how that influences effectiveness. There's this lack of data for extremes. They take more space, it takes time, and the economics are still very, very fuzzy, contrasting with engineered situations where we have solutions where we have a lot of expertise and institutional structures that favour the implementation of engineered solutions. They bring immediate benefits. The economics are really, well, relatively speaking, very easy, but they're not dynamic. They fail very quickly over time. There's no co-benefits. They tend to deal with single hazards, and also there's some evidence to suggest that they also cause people to have a false sense of security about the threats. So this is pointing to that in many situations, coastal situations and in river catchments, we're looking towards hybrid solutions where green and grey approaches can really protect and reinforce one another. And we're looking to a world where multifunctional landscapes, where all these elements come together, is what we need to be working towards, where you can combine hybrid with protected areas with engineered solutions. But the problem is that although this work is quite advanced in the sense of coastal and catchment planning, what's not happening at all is that all this understanding that many of you have about ecosystem resilience and tipping points is rarely, if ever, informing coastal and catchment planning. So this is a topic that came up yesterday. Our understanding of the devastating impacts of climate change on the resilience of ecosystems is not informing policies. So there's a lot of policy around afforestation, and that isn't being informed by our understanding of what it's going to take to make sure that those forests are resilient. And our understanding, too, that now in a changing world, forests might not be the best ecosystem to try and support. In California, for example, example, a recent work showing that's actually grasslands that are going to be able to maintain mitigation and provide adaptation services, not forests. So we need to have a very open mind when we talk about nature-based solutions, to think about ecosystems of a whole and embracing, as we talked about yesterday, change. There's lots of work. We talked, again, colleagues yesterday mentioned this sort of interest around trade-offs. We know there are lots of trade-offs in nature-based solutions, depending on sort of what set of ecosystem services you're focusing on. So vegetation generally delivers in terms of attenuating wave energy, stabilizing slopes and shores, regulating flood. However, the extent to which it also enhances or harms water yield, provides biodiversity benefits and other ecosystem services, and the extent to which it can effectively store carbon over the long term are very much mediated by scale and by diversity. And what increasing numbers of studies are showing, that if you increase the restoration of natural or semi-natural habitats, you're going to more likely achieve, at least over the medium to long term, synergies among these different ecosystem services rather than trade-offs. In fact, there's some great work now coming out of China, especially on the Loess Plateau, where China has been doing a lot of afforestation for many decades. And whilst that afforestation programs have been very, very effective in terms of, stabilizing erosion and actually increasing biodiversity and carbon capture, they've massively increased water shortages in many areas. Whereas natural vegetation, had it been worked with and encouraged, wouldn't have had such a devastating impact on blue water availability. So there's all sorts of interesting nuance and science around scale and diversity. So in terms of knowns, where are we at? Well, we know that nature-based solutions can support many different dimensions, economic, social and ecological dimensions of human adaptation. However, we also know that effectiveness is a function of biotic, abiotic and event properties, so properties of the storms, properties of the floods and fires, that nature-based disaster risk reduction often compromises many other dimensions of adaptation, and that diversity promotes synergies and minimises those trade-offs. In terms of unknowns, again, it's about bringing our understanding of extreme events and impacts on tipping points into adaptation planning. And there's a lot of really cool work to be done, really grounded in ecological theory, trying to understand the links between ecological resilience and human adaptation, and a lot more work needed on socioeconomic outcomes. But let me just say this, I think the lowest hanging fruit is to make sure that what we do know about ecosystems and biodiversity gets to where it's needed, because frankly this is not happening at all. There is a lot of hyperbole, I think I would call it, in the international policy discourse about nature-based solutions and climate solutions. And we have lots of these big multilateral, international agreements. The New York Declaration on Forest, is a pledge to end deforestation by 2030. Bond Challenge wants to restore 350 million hectares by 2012. We've got the new Trillion Trees partnership. Trillion Trees, the aim is to plant that by 2050. And then the biggest political momentum, of course, of all is behind the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement asks all parties to ensure the integrity of all ecosystems, including oceans. And in an analysis that I was heavily involved in, we found out that 65% of signatories to the Paris Agreement commit to nature-based solutions, either as an adaptation tool or as a mitigation tool. However, these high-level pledges are not being informed by science and not met by science-based action on the ground. There's a huge emphasis on afforestation or reforestation. 77% of pledges talk about that in their NDCs. Key ecosystems for mitigation and adaptation are poorly represented, so poor representation of coastal ecosystems, carbon-rich peatlands and grasslands barely feature in these climate pledges, which is a serious problem. And targets don't take all this understanding we have about ecological adaptive capacity and resilience, or even stewardship, into account. These policies are full of claims. For example, China aims to increase its forest stock by 4.5 billion cubic meters, and India pledges to increase its carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide by increasing forest cover. But what does this really mean? So in order to sort of address this issue and this disconnect between the science and the policy, behind which there's so much momentum now, is to really get the evidence together, so existing evidence, and make sure that's translated and communicated in a way that's meaningful to those decision makers. But even more important than the evidence, I would say, we need to really work on the finance, and many people have referred to this. We need to really get behind, trying to figure out whether payment for ecosystem services can really work at scale. It's worked brilliantly well in Costa Rica, but can that be scaled up? We need to really improve our natural capital valuation so that it incorporates biodiversity assets, and I know colleagues in this room are really working on that problem, and that's incredibly important. And related to that, we need to better understand governance. Governance needs to be flexible and cooperative and open systems, wherein the Ministry of Education is talking to the Ministry of Energy and is communicating with the Department of Fisheries and Agriculture. These are all very separate entities in many governments at the moment, and in order to scale up nature-based solutions, we need to work with that, and we need to change that, we need to understand it. So there's a real need to bring all this together and conduct genuine inter- and transdisciplinary knowledge exchange and really improve the scholarship around this concept of socio-ecological systems. If we do that, we might be able to address this issue. Now, this is a slide I frequently put in my talks, and I think I tweet this every week, and I will continue doing so until it looks differently. This is a situation where we have spending on the Sustainable Development Goals is basically inversely related to the dependencies and relationships between biosphere, society and economy. And we really need to, nature-based solutions have so much potential, but we need to engage as a community to address this problem. So a bright spot in an otherwise very depressing week last week was a talk given in Oxford by Christiana Figueres that I had the great opportunity to attend. In that talk, she was advocating stubborn optimism, and we're going to need a lot of that as we deal with the ecological fallout of political chaos, not least most recently in Brazil. But she also was advocating radical collaboration, and it's, I hope, in the spirit of radical collaboration that we emerge from this meeting. We need to go beyond our silos. We need to not only, as natural scientists, engage with social scientists and economists and engineers, but we also need to be talking to philosophers. We need to be talking to psychologists. We need to do all this and bring all this together in order to change the zeitgeist about our relationship with nature. Thank you. David. Chris.
Hi, Chris Sandham, University of Sussex. I was interested again from the social science side. I get the impression people, the public, like to buy peace of mind. They like to buy a wall, a hard defence. It makes them feel better about it. I was wondering if there's anything or whether nature-based solutions provide that peace of mind to the public.
Well, I think in many parts of the world, I mean in the US in particular, the evidence is there for them to see about the merits of maintaining natural ecosystems. For example, the protection afforded by natural wetlands. I mean, people that lived behind natural wetlands didn't lose their homes. Those that live in more exposed regions, there's a lot of damage to property. So in the Western world, where where the zeitgeist really needs to change, there is actually evidence every day, every year occurring around them that by working with nature in their immediate environment, that can really help them deal with climate change impacts. Okay, yeah.
Bhaskar Veera from Cambridge. Nathalie, thanks for that. As you probably know, I was involved in the 2014 study that you cited, and it's amazing to see the 50% of the publications have come since then, so I'm really looking forward to your update. One of the things we found was that the peer-reviewed literature had some evidence, but there was a lot of evidence in the grey literature. And we struggled with that a lot because there's a lot of practice in this area, nature-based solutions, which doesn't make it into the academic literature.
Yep.
And we found it really difficult because we were aware of this practice, but equally the constraints of a systematic review meant that we had to do something that was focused around the published literature. And I can imagine that if the academic literature has exploded the way you've just demonstrated, practice must be exploding as well. And I guess this is a sort of more general question for us in the room, not just you specifically, which is how do we find systematic ways to review practice which is not in the published literature? Are there ways that we can actually incorporate that into our evidence syntheses, especially when we're trying to make them have policy influence?
I think that's very, very important. I mean, this is a huge task, and we're just doing it from 2012, and it's just the peer-reviewed literature, and there's still thousands of studies, and the studies are distributed across such disparate literatures that the language and framing is really, really intractable. So the whole coding just of that is incredibly, incredibly complicated. But we sort of said, well, we'll start with this, and then once we've done this, which is obviously going to be a straightforward task, proved it hasn't, we'll then move on to tackling this very important question. Because there has been an explosion of EBA projects across the globe, ecosystem-based adaptation, and there's a lot of this going on, and there is rich learning there. Now there are other platforms, for example, We Adapt and a few others, that are trying to get people to basically publish or place their findings. So there are these structures and platforms via the internet, via social media, where we're trying to sort of bring some of that evidence together. But it does remain a major problem, and we need to be very, very careful about. We need not to ignore that. And I agree that it would be really good to have a brainstorm with people here now, sometime in the future, about how we can really address that issue and make sure that day-to-day learning, which is going on in places all over the globe, really does inform policy. So no, I'm glad you raised that, and to work on it. Sandra?
Yes, I was wondering whether in the evidence you gathered, you were able to tease out where benefits would be from active restoration or management for EBA and NBS, as opposed to just benefits from existing bits of nature and well-preserved bits of nature. Because in my understanding, the real spirit of NBS and EBA is to encourage restoration or management.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we go through the papers we're coding as to whether this is an observational study that looked at the benefits, like these avoided losses studies, looked at the benefits of existing areas, and we're distinguishing those from sort of active reforestation programs and restoration programs. Most of the literature in that, in terms of experimental and more robust evidence looking at different restoration practices, comes from forestry. So I said that a lot of the evidence was from the coastal zone. An awful lot of evidence is also in the forestry literature, which is enormous and ever growing, and there's a lot of empirical work, and there is also a lot of very valuable modelling work. So obviously those modelling studies need to be grounded in the empirical studies, but there's a lot of attention now being placed on really trying to sort of model different restoration scenarios and look at what the outcomes of those different scenarios are for people, and in terms of regulating services. Lots of work in the US, actually. There's a recent study across 2,000 watersheds in which we're modelling the impact of forest thinning, for example, and the extent to which that, the influence that has on blue water, so groundwater discharge, the availability of water for crops and for urban centres. And it's complex. If the climate is drying, it makes sense to thin. If it's not drying, if it's getting wetter, actually that will, thinning forests will actually make the situation worse. So people are onto that. Bringing all that together to sort of generate some really clear, straightforward, policy relevant information is quite challenging. Gosh, I don't know. That's so many hands. Okay, yeah.
One thing that I worry about a little bit of this, and I've looked at some of the forestry and water studies, is people really, really want nature-based solutions to work. And we know there's biases in the peer-reviewed literature about studies where you see an outcome as opposed to not seeing an outcome. And I'm concerned about that kind of bias in the peer-reviewed literature, and I would be extremely concerned about that kind of bias in the gray literature. Yeah. Because if you've already invested in a project, you are really invested in it having been effective. Yeah. And I was wondering if there's even any way to deal with this problem.
Yeah, as part of that brainstorming session about how we deal with the non-peer-reviewed literature, that is like top of the list of issues, because actually trying to get information about failure, what we need to know is when it doesn't work, right? And you're very, very difficult to get that information from the EBA projects across the world, where donors want to know that their projects work, right? And so trying to get that, and trying to get organisations to share information on learning and information on failure is very, very challenging. Yeah, in the period, that's one advantage of starting on the peer-reviewed literature at first, is that it has fewer, maybe slightly fewer of those issues. But certainly there's a lot to be, and we are coding for framing. There's a lot to be discerned about how people frame the problem that reveals their biases, and we've got that in our coding framework. And it's like, okay, maybe we can explore a little bit about the influence of framing around nature-based solutions and whether or not positive or negative effects were reported. So there might be some interesting technical ways of dealing with it. But I hear you, it is a problem. There's a problem in science in general, though, isn't it? Basically. Hi, Bron.
Thanks, Bronson Griscom, the Nature Conservancy. This actually is falling very much off of Kate's point about bias in trying to analyze in this kind of analysis you're doing. So at the Nature Conservancy, we are sort of informally trying to understand and constantly trying to understand, how do we learn from all the experience we've had in implementing nature-based solutions. What dawned upon me is the only way I think we, at least in the Nature Conservancy, can really do that well is with a randomized controlled design where you're actually experimentally designing and implementing, a set of interventions across multiple geographies, and actually sort of getting the science to the front end of that process. But I have yet to find any example of where that's been done at a large scale. So I guess
there are lots. Actually. There are
great.
lots. It's a small subset of the 1,000 papers, admittedly, but there are some pretty robust modelling studies. Clearly, you can do a lot with a modelling study, but then that has assumptions. But there are also quite a lot of really cool work coming out of the Netherlands in particular, where the design is deeply scientific, and we can have a little bit more faith in the results. However, there are also assumptions in those, and biodiversity tends not to feature too well in those experimental setups. But yeah, there is a lot of work, and we're hoping the point of the work we're doing is so that people like you and your organisation can go, okay, what's the evidence? Here are the papers, and then we're going to do reviewing and translating of that so that it's kind of policy relevant. Because there's no point just pointing a policymaker to a list of 3 papers. We need to provide an extra service in translating that. But that's a great question. Hi, Val.
I was going to make the failure point, but I'm not going to make that. I'm going to make the adaptation evidence point more generally. Okay, we're beating ourselves up about whether we have the answers on success or failure with nature-based solutions, but there's actually a wider problem. That whole issue also applies to engineered solutions. People aren't prone to publishing the "I built a dam and it failed." Okay, so we know about the odd disaster. We know, and we don't know very much about effectiveness into the future. Now, the engineered solutions are better documented because they've got engineers, basically, and those engineers are used to modeling the tolerances and projected effectivenesses of those structures. I actually would put this on the table as a science challenge for the rest of us about trying to get some of the modeling that we do as a community to the same sort of standard, so that we can talk about tolerances, points of failure, and long-term trajectories for the effectiveness of these systems. But please, please, please don't think it's just an NBS problem. What is adaptation, what is effective adaptation is out there on the table as a really big issue, sort of across the disciplines. And I think it's one of the things that really deserves a lot of attention in this context.
That's brilliant. Thank you for making that point. Hi, Nancy.
Nancy Knowlton, Smithsonian. Thanks for your presentation, ending on stubborn optimism. I have a couple of thoughts that are related to the finding that we don't know about what's going on with extreme events. Because of course that's exactly what climate predictions tell us. So extreme events are going to be more and more common, and I worry a little bit that we might inadvertently go down the same road that we did with biopharmaceuticals, and saying that we should protect nature because they're going to provide us all these drugs, and then economic analyses show that it just wasn't a viable. It wasn't an economically viable way of protecting forests. On the other, and then the other thing that concerns me, sort of thinking about the way people buy insurance. I mean, one of the first things, at least in the United States, where we don't have a normal insurance system, people buy is insurance for catastrophic medical conditions. And so they might not have insurance to go to the doctors, that the equivalent would be routine sort of flooding, but they do have insurance in case, something really catastrophic happens. And so particularly in developed countries, you're going to wind up with a situation where people want the catastrophic insurance, which they might think, or whatever, the studies showed that would be a giant seawall. I mean, that's the nature engineering version of catastrophic medical insurance. On the other hand, in developing countries where a huge amount of biodiversity exists and where people really are vulnerable, that option of spending whatever it is per foot of seawall is just simply not that. I mean, they don't have those resources. So it seems to me that one place where a real emphasis should be put is on developing these solutions in a developing country context, because there the natural human inclination to build the biggest wall possible is really not an option at all.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that there is a tropical focus or a low-income country focus on nature-based solutions in the climate and the Paris Agreement climate pledges. And really, I was going to try and turn the slides back, but that's where all the pledges are. Really, it's a developed world don't really talk much about nature-based solutions in their climate policies. We are nonetheless investigating it quite seriously. Throughout Europe and North America, at least. Absolutely, but even in extreme events, a lot of the engineering solutions fail too. And it isn't working for them. I mean, Val's absolutely right to say that this isn't just the lack of evidence for extremes isn't just a nature-based solution situation. And what all the evidence is pointing to is developing these hybrid structures where you have a seawall to protect nature, you have a nature to protect a seawall, depending upon projections and likely intensities of threat. And just so really recognizing that there are lots of benefits of both approaches. Nature-based solutions are not a panacea. We need to be very pragmatic about this and sort of work together to get the engineering science and the ecological science on a par with each other in terms of technical brilliance, so that we can, for particular situations, particular geographies, we can actually design very carefully our landscapes and our seascapes, so that given we don't know exactly which direction, things are changing, we're covered for all sorts of eventualities. And it's that sort of concept of the future that I think is a realistic and viable one, but still lots of work to be done. Thank you. Yes, time's up.